Imagine waking up one morning and realizing that one election, one single vote in one country could determine whether a war ends or escalates on the other side of the planet. Not metaphorically, literally. The weapons that keep firing or go silent, the ceasefires that get signed or get buried, the alliances that hold or collapse entirely, all of it, hanging on who wins the White House. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's the world we're living in right now. And today, we're going to pull back the curtain and look at how American elections have become the most powerful geopolitical force on Earth. Not because America is always right, but because everyone else has no choice but to react to it. So, let's get into it. Right now, as you're watching this, there are at least 3 major active conflicts where American policy is either fueling the fire, trying to put it out, or doing both at the same time, depending on which day of the week it is. Ukraine is still fighting a grinding war against Russia that has already cost hundreds of thousands of lives. The Middle East is in one of its most volatile periods in decades. And in the Pacific, the tension between the United States and China over Taiwan is quietly building into what some analysts are calling the most dangerous standoff since the Cold War. Each of these crises has its own history, its own local politics, its own complex web of causes. But here's the thing, most news channels won't say out loud. All 3 of them are deeply, structurally connected to who sits in the Oval Office. The American president doesn't just respond to these wars. In many ways, the American president shapes them, the weapons that flow or stop flowing, the red lines that get enforced or ignored, the phone calls that get made at 2 a.m. or never get made at all. And when an election comes around, every dictator, every rebel commander, every prime minister, and every foreign policy strategist on the planet starts doing math. They start calculating. They start making moves based on what they think is coming next out of Washington. So let's walk through this carefully, because this is genuinely one of the most important political dynamics of our time, and it's way more fascinating than the nightly news makes it sound. Let's start with Ukraine, because it's the most obvious example of how American politics directly shapes a shooting war. Rewind to February 2022. Russia invades Ukraine in what Vladimir Putin calls a special military operation. The whole world is watching, and the key question in every capital from Berlin to Tokyo is, how is America going to respond? At the time, the Biden administration makes a decision that will define the entire trajectory of the conflict. They're going to support Ukraine significantly, with weapons, intelligence, training, and money. But, and this is the critical part, they're going to do it carefully. They're going to manage escalation. They're not going to give Ukraine everything it asks for because they're terrified of triggering a direct NATO-Russia confrontation. Now, you can agree or disagree with that strategy. Reasonable people do both. But here's what happened as a result. Ukraine gets enough support to survive, but not always enough to decisively win. The war grinds on. Months turn into years. The casualty figures become almost too large to comprehend. And then something fascinating happens. The American political cycle starts intersecting with the war in real time. Because here's the crazy part the media mostly glossed over. The 2024 presidential election didn't just change American foreign policy after the fact. It changed the war while it was still being fought. Every major player in the conflict started adjusting their behavior based on polling numbers in Pennsylvania and Michigan. Think about that for a second. Ukrainian commanders are developing battle plans. Russian negotiators are deciding whether to take talks seriously. European leaders are calculating how much of their own money to spend, and all of them are watching obsessively what Donald Trump is saying on the campaign trail, because Trump had made one thing very clear. He thought the war in Ukraine was not America's problem. He suggested he could end it in 24 hours. He raised real doubts about whether he would continue the level of military support that Biden had been providing. And whether you think that was a smart position or a reckless one, the effect on the ground was immediate. Ukrainian officials started hedging. They started talking more urgently about what Europe would do if American support dried up. They accelerated certain military operations, partly because there was a genuine fear that the political window for American backing might be closing. Russia, on the other hand, started playing for time. And this is classic Putin strategy. He has always understood that time is a weapon. If you can outlast your enemy's political will, you don't need to outfight them. You just need to survive until the election goes your way. This is where the real chess game gets interesting. Now pay close attention to this next part, because this is where it gets really layered. When Trump won the 2024 election, the reaction in Moscow was carefully restrained. Not celebratory, not triumphant, restrained. And that tells you a lot, because the Kremlin isn't naive. They've been burned before by assuming an American president would give them everything they wanted. They know that Washington has its own internal politics, its own bureaucratic inertia, its own military-industrial complex that has a very powerful interest in certain policies continuing, regardless of who's in the White House. But they also know that tone matters, that rhetoric matters, that a president who publicly calls a war a waste and questions why America should be paying for it creates a very different diplomatic environment than one who calls it a defense of democratic civilization. So Putin starts doing what Putin always does. He probes, he tests, he makes a move and watches the response. He floats the idea of negotiations while continuing to bomb civilian infrastructure. He talks about peace while his military is still advancing. He's not being sincere. He's gathering information. He's checking how much the new American administration actually wants an exit and how much they're willing to pay for one. And here's the irony that nobody wants to say out loud. A president who wants to end the war quickly might actually be easier for Russia to negotiate with, not because Russia is getting a fair deal, but because they understand that this president has a political incentive to declare victory and move on. Get a photo op, claim a win. Call it peace, even if it isn't really. Zelensky knows this too. That's why Ukrainian diplomacy in this period has been some of the most intense and creative in the entire war. They're trying to lock in commitments, military, financial, political, before the ground shifts under them. This is not unusual in history, by the way. This pattern, where foreign leaders race to lock in deals or change facts on the ground before an American transition of power, is as old as American global dominance itself. Most people think the Ukraine story is about democracy versus authoritarianism, and in some ways, it is. But it's also, and maybe primarily, about energy politics, European sovereignty, and the fundamental question of whether the post-Cold War security architecture of Europe is going to survive. Let me explain what I mean. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, and then the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, there was a brief, extraordinary moment when it seemed like the whole world might reorganize around a new set of rules. Liberal democracy, open markets, international institutions. The idea that big countries couldn't just invade small countries anymore. Not because they lacked the military power, but because the cost in terms of global standing and economic isolation would be too high. That was the theory, and for about 2 decades, it mostly held. But Russia never fully accepted it. China never fully accepted it. And there were always cracks. Kosovo, Iraq, Georgia, Crimea, moments where the rules bent or broke entirely. What Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine did was blow up the fiction entirely. It said, directly and violently, the old rules are dead. The strong do what they want. The weak suffer what they must. Ancient Greek wisdom, brutal modern application. Now, here's where the American election connects to something much bigger than just Ukraine. Because if America signals, through its election, through its foreign policy choices, that it's pulling back from its role as the enforcer of that international system, then every country on Earth has to recalculate. Every country has to ask, do we still trust the American security guarantee? Do we still build our defense strategy around the assumption that Washington will show up? And the answer to that question is currently being answered differently in different capitals. Germany is spending more on defense than it has in decades. Poland is building one of the largest armies in Europe. Finland and Sweden joined NATO. These are not small symbolic gestures. These are fundamental strategic pivots driven by a very simple calculation. We cannot afford to assume America will always be here. Meanwhile, on the other side of the equation, and this is the part that should make everyone uncomfortable, countries that have been testing American resolve are watching the same signals and drawing the opposite conclusion. Let's talk about the Middle East, because the situation there shows a different but equally important dimension of how American elections reshape global conflicts. Here's the honest truth about American Middle East policy over the last several decades. It has been a long series of contradictions, miscalculations, and uncomfortable alliances, held together by a combination of strategic interests, domestic politics, and inertia. America has spent trillions of dollars and thousands of lives in the region. It has toppled governments, armed rebel groups, signed peace deals, and walked away from peace deals. It has been simultaneously the most powerful external player in the region and the one most resented for that power. And every 4 or 8 years, when a new president comes in, the entire regional balance has to be renegotiated. Think about what happened with the Abraham Accords. The Trump administration's first term produced a genuine diplomatic achievement, normalizing relations between Israel and several Arab states: Bahrain, UAE, Morocco, Sudan. It was dismissed by critics as superficial, and in some ways, it was. It didn't solve the Palestinian question. It didn't create real peace. But it changed the political geography of the region in ways that are still playing out. Then Biden comes in, and the tone shifts. More emphasis on human rights. More pressure on Saudi Arabia. More distance from some of the more transactional relationships Trump had cultivated. The Abraham Accords framework stalls. The big prize, a Saudi-Israeli normalization deal, keeps getting discussed, but never quite lands. And then October 7th, 2023 happens. Hamas launches the most devastating attack on Israeli soil since the state's founding. Israel responds with a military campaign in Gaza that draws international condemnation for its scale and civilian cost. And suddenly, the entire carefully constructed regional architecture starts shaking. Here's what most political analysis gets wrong about this moment. It frames the American response as primarily a moral or humanitarian question. And yes, those dimensions matter. But the deeper geopolitical reality is that America's response to this crisis is also a strategic signal to every other player in the region and beyond. When America provides military support to Israel, it's not just making a statement about Israel. It's making a statement about how America treats its allies. It's telling Taiwan, we don't abandon partners under pressure. It's telling Saudi Arabia, we have strong commitments in this region. It's telling Iran and Russia and China, the American security umbrella is still real. And when there are calls to condition that support, or pause it, or attach more requirements to it, those signals also get read by everyone else, not just as a statement about Gaza, but as a statement about American reliability in general. This is the brutal calculus of great power politics. Every decision is also a communication. Every action is also a precedent. And an election can completely change the frequency that America is broadcasting on. Now here's the part that gets really wild, and I promise this is worth paying attention to. While everyone is focused on Ukraine and the Middle East, the biggest strategic question of the next 20 years is quietly being decided in the Pacific, and it's directly connected to what happens in American elections. China and the Taiwan question. Let's keep this simple. Taiwan is a self-governing island that China considers a breakaway province. Taiwan considers itself a de facto independent country. America has a policy called strategic ambiguity, which basically means they sell weapons to Taiwan, but they've never explicitly promised to defend it militarily if China attacks. Strategic ambiguity was designed to deter both Chinese aggression and Taiwanese independence declarations. Keep everyone uncertain. Keep everyone cautious. But here's the problem. Strategic ambiguity only works if everyone believes the ambiguity is real. If China starts to believe that America won't actually fight for Taiwan, the deterrence collapses. And if Taiwan starts to believe America will definitely fight for them, they might take risks that trigger exactly the conflict everyone is trying to avoid. So what does this have to do with elections? Everything, because every statement an American presidential candidate makes about Taiwan gets analyzed to death by Beijing's strategic planners. When Trump said in an interview that Taiwan should pay more for its own defense, China heard, "The Americans are transactional." When Biden said on multiple occasions that yes, America would defend Taiwan, only to have his staff walk it back each time, China heard, there's confusion and incoherence at the top. Neither signal is reassuring, but they're different kinds of unnerving. The Trump approach suggests that American commitment is negotiable, that it's a market transaction rather than a strategic obligation. That's actually more dangerous in some ways, because it invites China to make an offer, to test what the price of American neutrality might be. The Biden approach, with its mix of strong statements and institutional backpedaling, suggests an administration that is both more committed and more internally divided, which creates its own form of uncertainty. And Xi Jinping is watching all of this very carefully. Here's the part that should genuinely concern anyone who thinks carefully about the next decade. China has been on a military build-up timeline. They've been explicit about their goal of reunification with Taiwan, and internal Chinese Communist Party documents and public statements have pointed toward the late 2020s or early 2030s as a potential window, when China believes its military capabilities will have reached a level where a cross-strait operation becomes plausible. Now, China doesn't necessarily want a war. Wars are expensive, unpredictable, and economically disruptive. And China's economy has enough problems right now without adding a major military conflict. But here's the thing about military windows and political timelines. They interact in ways that can create accidental momentum toward conflict, even when no one is actively seeking it. If China's military planners believe their window is opening, and simultaneously they observe American political signals suggesting reduced commitment or internal division, the temptation to test the situation can become overwhelming. And here's the real irony. An American election that produces signals of retrenchment or transactionalism, even if it's motivated by genuine concerns about American overextension, can paradoxically increase the risk of conflict by making deterrence less credible. This is the nightmare scenario that keeps serious strategists up at night. Not a deliberate war chosen rationally by all parties, but a war that happens because someone misread the signals. Because the deterrence calculation broke down, because one side thought the other was bluffing and they weren't, or was bluffing and they weren't. The American election doesn't just determine American policy. It shapes the information environment in which potentially catastrophic decisions get made in Beijing, Moscow, Tehran, and Pyongyang. Let me bring this back to something more human for a moment, because it's easy to get lost in the chess game and forget that the pieces on the board are real people. There are soldiers right now in eastern Ukraine in muddy trenches who have no idea what American domestic politics looks like. They know what the ground looks like. They know what Russian artillery sounds like. They know which of their friends are still alive and which aren't. There are civilians in Gaza who have lost everything and are not thinking about American electoral maps. They're thinking about whether they can find food, whether their children are safe. There are families in Taiwan who have lived their entire lives under the shadow of a cross-strait threat, who watch American political news not as entertainment or information, but as a survival calculation. The distance between American political debates and the real-world consequences of those debates is enormous. And that gap is one of the most troubling features of how global power works in the modern era. The people who vote in American elections are making decisions that will affect people who had absolutely no voice in that election. That's not an argument against American democracy. It's an argument for taking that democracy and its global consequences seriously. Now, pay close attention to this next part, because this is where everything we've talked about comes together. There's a school of thought in American foreign policy, and it's been gaining momentum, that says America has been doing too much for too long. That the era of American global leadership has been enormously costly and has produced mixed results at best. That it's time for America to focus on itself, to let other countries handle their own problems, to stop writing blank checks to allies who should be paying their own way. This is not an unreasonable position. There are serious, thoughtful people who hold it. But here's where it gets complicated. Because the world that exists today was built on the assumption of American engagement. The alliances, the institutions, the trade relationships, the security guarantees, all of it was constructed on the premise that America would remain involved. You can't just walk away from that architecture without something collapsing. And here's the brutal irony of the whole debate. The very fact that Europe has been able to spend so little on defense for so long, which is one of the legitimate criticisms of NATO burden sharing, is itself a product of American security guarantees. You don't need to spend money on defense if you believe someone else is going to provide it. So, when Americans say, why are we paying for Europe's defense? The answer is partly because you agreed to. Because your country, for its own strategic reasons during the Cold War, decided to extend that guarantee. You built a system of dependency, and now you're angry that the dependent countries are dependent.